Namaste and hello. This is your Sanskrit instructor welcoming you back into lesson number 19, which is also part 2 for the introduction to conjugation. The last thing that we went over in the previous video was that the Sanskrit verb conjugated in a finite tense has 3 persons and 3 numbers. Those 3 persons is first person, second person, and third person, and the 3 numbers are singular, dual, and plural. I will scroll back up to the table so that we can have a quick reminder as to what the format for the Sanskrit conjugation is. Notice first person is I, the two of us, we. Second person is you, the two of you, you all. That's the plural form. Then third person is he, she, it, the two of them, or they all. So that is the format. And before we go into actually conjugating a Sanskrit verb, there are 3 things that we need to understand. So that is the verbal root, the verbal base, and the last thing that we need to understand are the terminations and the conjugation, the terminations or the conjugation endings. So the verbal root is the original form of the verb. The verbal root is the original form of the verb. That Sanskrit word for the verbal root is dhatu. The verbal root is usually untouched. We usually don't do anything with it. The only thing that we'll understand from the verbal root is the meaning of that verb. The verbal base, however, is what is the form assumed by the verbal root before the terminations or the conjugation endings are added. The Sanskrit word for the verbal base is anga. When forming a verb, it is our responsibility to form the correct verbal base from the verbal root. Using the incorrect base for the intended verbal root may change the entire meaning of your sentence, which is the last thing that we want. There are several rules to forming the verbal base, so now we'll be moving on to learning how to form the verbal base. The verbal base depends partly on the strengthening of the radical vowel. What is a radical vowel? The radical vowel is basically the vowel that is inside of the root, is the vowel of the root. So there are 2 degrees of strengthening your radical vowel. There is either guna or there's Vrddhi. What do they mean by strengthening? So remember our vowels that we learned in the very beginning? A, I, u, ri, right? So, is a strengthened version of a. A is more strengthened. I is more strengthened. So that's what they mean by strengthening a radical vowel. So there's 2 degrees. The first degree of strengthening is guna. The second degree of strengthening is Vrddhi. So obviously Vrddhi is going to be a lot more stronger. There are 10 different conjugations in Sanskrit. The verbal root will either take guna or Vrddhi depending on the type of conjugation being used. So you wouldn't know whether to take guna or Vrddhi until you know which type of conjugation, whether it's the first, second, or the 10th conjugation. You wouldn't know whether to put it in guna or Vrddhi depending on the conjugation. That conjugation, whether it's the first, second, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, that conjugation will tell you whether to put that verbal root into guna or Vrddhi before conjugating into I go, you go, he or she goes, I am, you are, okay? So, let's say that I give you a verbal root that starts with, that has an in it. A verbal root that has an in it. Either at the middle or at the end. If the conjugation calls for that verbal root to take guna, then the you're just going to leave it how it is and you're going to keep it as If that root has to take Vrddhi because of the type of conjugation that it is, then that is going to have to be strengthened and changed to in that root. Then, and that's how you would have to form your base. In your base, you're going to have to change that into Now, if your verbal root has an and has to take guna, then that in your base, when you're forming your base, you're going to take the root and you're going to change the into an to form your verbal base. If it's Vrddhi, then you're just going to keep it as It or e, if your verbal root has an it or e, if that conjugation, depending on which number conjugation it is, if that conjugation is asking you to take that verbal root into guna, that it or e is going to change into an a. If it's going to take Vrddhi, then that it or e is going to change into an I. If that verbal root has an u or u, that u or u could change into an o for guna, or change into an au in Vrddhi. If your root has a ri, when you're creating your base, your verbal base, that ri would either change into an ad or an ad. If your verbal root has a lri, your base, the lri, is either going to change into an al into your verbal base, or it's going to change into an al. This may not make sense to you right now, and it might make more sense once we go into the next video and we actually start going into the first conjugation. So for now, what I want you to understand before going into the next video is understand what a verbal root is, understand what a verbal base is, and understand that a verbal base, forming the verbal base, depends on the radical vowel. You need to know how to strengthen that radical vowel, and the two ways of strengthening that radical vowel is either guna and Vrddhi. And make yourself familiar with what the vowels could change into, whether it is guna or Vrddhi. So familiarize yourself with this table that I have presented here for you. And trust me, everything will fall into place by the time we're actually creating verbal bases ourselves, and that is what we're going to do in the next video. If you have any questions, please feel free to send an email to mdg.sanskrit@gmail.com, and I will see you in the next video. This is your Sanskrit instructor signing off with a namaste.